So after the fall of Wilmington to federal troops in February of 1865 and the eventual end of the Civil War, we see that the southern landscape is changing quite dramatically. While many southern landowners have actually decided to flee their plantations during the war, whether due to being too close to the front lines or fearing for their lives due to the yellow fever epidemic that was happening here in Wilmington in 1862, much of the land here around the lower Cape Fear was left unattended. And so from there, when federal authorities start to make their way into Wilmington, including the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, that particular agency starts to think about how they can take care of the well-being of freed slaves, as well as deal with helping reconstruct the Southern society and economy. And so one of the primary things that they decide to do is start to confiscate what they believe to be abandoned lands. And of course, along with that comes the debate over what the definition of abandoned lands really is. And so for Southerners and many plantation owners who had left their plantations, they believed that they would be returning to them after the war was over. And so instead of leaving them completely abandoned, they had simply just vacated. But at some point in time, we see that many federal agencies start to create a system of confiscating these lands, which they deem to be abandoned. And from there, they plan on redistributing those lands to freedmen or freed slaves, and then create a new society based on that of the Northern labor system. And so with kind of creating a wage labor system that freed slaves could work by, it would emulate those free labor ideals of Northern industry. So what happens eventually when Andrew Johnson actually allows for much of that confiscated land to be returned to their rightful owners or contracted owners according to oaths of allegiance and so forth after 1865, much of that land is back into the hands of whites. And it pushes many freedmen off of plots that they had originally squatted on during 1865. So eventually, really the system that comes out of 1865 and 66 is going to be one of sharecropping and tenant farming. And the Freedmen's Bureau, or that Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, is going to eventually become one of the overseers of contracts between white landowners and black tenant farmers. And so as that creates contracts and legal restrictions regarding the mobility of freed slaves, we begin to see a new society being born. But in some ways, it's not so different than that of slavery. We see many things happening to restrict the mobility of blacks. We also see labor contracts that are very restrictive and keeping them on one plantation or one farm for a long period of time. And overall, it's a system that will eventually get both white and black sharecroppers and tenant farmers encircled into debt. And as that happens, they are pretty much caught up in a system that they can't get out of. And so what happens towards the end of the 19th century, especially around Wilmington here, we begin to see many of these large plantations being sold off, divided up into smaller farms, and many of those farms become truck or produce farms. And much like here at Poplar Grove, which was actually a really lucky situation in some cases, this plantation was not divided up immediately, but remained a single operating farm for much of the early 20th century.